Hey, what's up? Dave with Brazos Valley Strength. Today, we're going to be talking about Romanian deadlifts and stiff leg deadlifts. This is not going to be a how-to guide. If you need some help on how to execute these movements, I have a bunch of videos on hinging. Specifically, just the how to hinge video is probably where you need to start. And then you can come back here for some of my even rule breaking is what might happen in this video. But for sure, I'm going to be talking about some of the specifics within programming for both of these. But more than anything, this is going to be my personal anecdote, my programming experience, my lifting experience, how I think I see these helping lifters most, and how I've experienced my strength improve by using these. So just to start off with, we need to define those two movements, right? So a stiff leg deadlift and a Romanian deadlift are really just going to be pure hinge movements. The difference between them is going to be that a stiff leg deadlift goes from the ground at a dead stop every single time. So think of it just like any other competition deadlift. Sumo, conventional, doesn't really matter. In this case, we are going to say that the stiff leg deadlift is always a conventional stance. I guess you could do them otherwise. I don't know that I would encourage it. But a stiff leg deadlift is dead stop every single time, and not necessarily including the eccentric. You don't necessarily need to lower it with a whole lot of control. Romanian deadlift, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite of that, right? So still a pure hinge, but we don't need to touch the ground every single time, and it's going to be a little bit more eccentric dominant. We're going to make sure that we're controlling the eccentric during the entirety of that lift. So we just want to start there, right? I don't want to define them any further than that just based on our definitions of those two movements, because in my programming and execution advice, there's going to be a lot of overlap between the two of them. So I do think at times people tend to encourage the stiff leg deadlifts being a little bit more strict, right? Kind of high hips, legs a little bit straighter. And then some of the Romanian deadlifts at times, I think I see people encouraging people to bend their knees a little bit more and even round their backs more. Both of those things are going to be okay. And I'm actually going to say that they're okay on both. But just depending on what kind of lifter you are, potentially what stance you use in your deadlift, and where you're weak, those things may have some specific intent depending upon the lifter and the style that they use. So beyond that, a few more definitions here. Flexion and extension, I'm going to refer to a lot in both the back. I'm going to say back extension, back flexion, and then also hip extension and hip flexion. So if you don't know those, back flexion is going to be kind of like protraction, right? It's just going to be your back rounding forward, where extension is going to be the opposite, right? Going into a little bit more of an arched position. Hip flexion and then hip extension, again, are the same thing. So hip flexion is just when you are going down. Both of these movements on the way down at the very bottom of the lift, you are in much more hip flexion. At the top, your hips are closer to being straight in line with your trunk, right? So at that point, you are in hip extension. So if I'm using those words throughout, hopefully you can just remember those definitions and there won't really be any confusion there. And I think one of the big things that sometimes gets misunderstood when we're talking about deadlifts is specifically the back stuff and talking about back flexion or back extension. And most of the time, almost always, whenever I'm talking about back extension or like fighting for extension, most of the time, I'm fighting to move towards neutral and away from flexion. Almost never am I saying that I want to actually be in an extended position. And I wanted to bring that up here because I am going to say many times in this video that we're fighting for extension in the back. But I think the best way to think about it is that the cue that you will be using in those positions is that you are fighting for extension. You're trying to move closer to extension than you are to flexion. But I don't think that there's really any circumstance that I would encourage a lifter to actually be in a very extended position. So that's probably the most important definition here, that if I say back extension, just think neutral instead of a flexed position. So I guess where we can really start with these is, generally speaking, why I would choose one over the other. So, in a very broad sense, I tend to use stiff leg deadlifts more for lower rep ranges and more for what I would consider strength building, right? So a lot of times I'm using these as a pure substitute for a deadlift, for a competition deadlift. And I think we've seen in some of my recent programs that I have taken out my secondary sumo day and replaced it oftentimes with stiff leg deadlifts instead. Generally speaking, in lower rep ranges. Sometimes down all the way into like the 3s, but 5s and 6s tend to be where I live with those. Whereas like with Romanian deadlifts, I tend to use these more for a hypertrophy movement, more for higher rep sets. And I think mostly this just comes down to practicality of the movements. They're very, very similar. And there's really not a big reason why a Romanian deadlift does not build strength, or we couldn't use a stiff leg deadlift to improve our hypertrophy. That's not true, but practically they tend to lead themselves some better opportunities within those lifts. So with a stiff leg deadlift, if we're training those without emphasizing the eccentric portion of the lift very much, that may give us an opportunity to train it relatively hard without getting a lot of fatigue. So just overall, eccentrically loaded movements tend to cause a little bit more muscle damage, tend to get us a little bit more sore, tend to get us at least having a sense of peripheral fatigue. Whereas the more that we limit our eccentrics, we can tend to train those at a little bit higher intensity, higher volume, and at least maintain our perception that we're feeling a little bit more fresh. So when we're training the stiff leg deadlifts fairly hard, my experience with myself and with most of my athletes here is that nobody has really expressed that stiff leg deadlifts very noticeably impact their perception of their fatigue. And I think that's important to where we can include these pretty easily in people's programs and get a pretty solid return, and that we're not having to worry too much about some sort of deficit that we're going to create that's going to impact our competition lifts. So just the fact that we're removing that eccentric, I think does have value. But on the other side of it, the Romanian deadlifts, where we're holding the bar for the whole time, tends to be pretty good for hypertrophy for all of those other reasons, because we are increasing the time under tension, because I do have that eccentric loading there. So there may be a little bit more cost associated with it, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Long term, building up our muscle mass is going to help everybody. So they could cross over very, very easily, but just practically keeping the bar in your hands the entire time, and I would encourage people to use straps too, but keeping yourself loaded against that weight the whole time tends to help people string together those reps a little bit easier, and just it ends up being maybe mentally a little bit more manageable to perform the Romanian deadlift for those higher rep sets. You could do either one if you wanted to. Now, beyond that, oftentimes I see the claim that people should be rounding their backs a little bit more on the Romanian deadlift than on the stiff leg deadlift. And I think sometimes it just is because the name is stiff leg deadlift and people really think that they have to adhere perfectly to that. But again, names don't need to determine exactly how we do it. We can use these exercises to perform different goals. But anyway, I don't think that that's incorrect. I tend to do it the opposite way, but I'll elaborate on exactly why. So first of all, I think what we need to do here is ask what goal we would accomplish by having a little bit more flexion, back rounding, in either one of the exercises. So generally speaking, the more extension that we have in our backs, kind of the straighter we are, we're going to tend to train the hamstrings a little bit more. So I think if we can try to make it that simple, at least to start off with, that the more extension that we maintain in our backs, it may lend itself a little bit more to direct hamstring training and a little bit more towards hypertrophy. The way that I would program things, I would tend to find value the most in higher rep sets, hopefully mitigating some of the total stress of a Romanian deadlift. Again, we talked about how potentially eccentric dominated exercises are going to add at least more peripheral fatigue and sometimes, total fatigue. So if I'm really emphasizing a little bit more of a strict execution here, a lot of times I feel like we can isolate some of that fatigue directly in the hamstrings while still adding value other places. On the other side of that, if we're flexing our backs a little bit more and rounding it, we're absolutely going to challenge all of those spinal extensor muscles, glutes a little bit more. If we round our backs a little bit more, we're going to shorten the hamstrings just a little bit because we actually get into a little bit of a posterior tilt with the pelvis. So we'll target the glutes slightly more than we would with our hips, with our back a little bit more extended. But overall, my feeling is that general fatigue cost, especially for high reps and especially with an eccentric rep, may be slightly higher. But again, having hard stuff that generates fatigue is not necessarily a bad thing. It just sometimes is harder to fit in the context of a total program, especially when we're really trying to emphasize strength. So my preference overall is actually to use a little bit more flexion in the stiff leg deadlift rather than the Romanian deadlift, especially for people who are good sumo deadlifters. So my thought here, the way that I explain it to my lifters and the way that I try to execute it is that what we are trying to do is we are trying to train that position that we are leaving the ground in under heavy loads, right? So all of my videos, I talk about pulling slack and pulling the arms long and creating a little bit more space from the upper body. So if we're moving into a little bit more protraction, potentially slightly more flexion in the upper back, and again, not a lot, we're going to be training that position in that slightly rounded, protracted position that we would end up in our very, very heavy deadlifts, and hopefully be able to learn how to maintain that position off the floor and really fight for our stability there. So the big deal is we're absolutely trying not to get more rounded. We're trying not to, collapse more. We are for sure fighting for extension, but in that position that is much more specific to our competition deadlift. You can for sure accomplish this during Romanian deadlifts, and I do. Snatch grip deadlifts are one of my favorite variations instead of just regular Romanian deadlifts, just because with the snatch grip we widen our hands out more. It tends to be a little bit more comfortable to kind of let the arms hang right there. We increase the range of motion just a little bit, but it gives us a good opportunity to train those upper back muscles that are very much going to be stretched while we're deadlifting very heavy loads, but then try to train that position in that stretch posture. So either one of these exercises can be trained in flexion or in a very strict position. Where I would choose a more strict position for people, especially on a stiff leg deadlift, would be a conventional deadlifter who already is kind of rounded a little bit more in their deadlift. And again, not that it's a bad thing, that may be where they feel the strongest. So we want to be able to still train the hamstrings in that hinge position and potentially give them the opportunity to get stronger in a little bit more neutral position. If we feel like they're rounding a little bit more than they should, we can use this as a variation away from their competition deadlift and train a little bit more neutrality in their deadlift. Now, on that note, I tend to not use as many of these very hinge dominant exercises for conventional deadlifters, just because of that total fatigue that they're already probably getting a good amount of overall. But I would for sure, for conventional deadlifters, encourage them to lean more towards these strict versions, the closer to extension, neutral positions with their knees a little bit straighter, just because we're probably already training their backs a lot more than what a sumo deadlifter is going to have to endure through normal training. So I think that is maybe the easiest split in the first place. is conventional deadlifters should probably be a little bit more strict when they're performing these exercises, whereas sumo deadlifters should maybe lean a little bit more towards that slightly rounded, slightly flexed position, but then fight very, very hard to maintain that. So as a few final thoughts here, I think one of the biggest ways where people are messing up their stiff leg deadlifts or really just not getting as much as they could out of them is they're not fighting nearly hard enough off the ground. It should be, in my mind, my stiff leg deadlift happens in the first few inches off the ground. And after that, I'm going. But for me, fighting for those first few inches is all that matters in what is going to transfer over to my competition lift. It's that intent, that effort that it takes to maintain that posture while things are really trying to break me in the other direction. So if you have stiff leg deadlifts, if you're trying to train stiff leg deadlifts, whether you're in a little bit more neutral position or a little bit more flexed over, make sure you are investing 100% in that little bottom portion of the lift and maintain that as much as you possibly can. Another thought here is most of the time, especially for sumo deadlifters, good sumo deadlifters, I tend to not really worry how flexed their knees are, especially on the stiff leg deadlift, because we're really going after the process, the feeling of that effort off the floor, and I'm not worrying so much specifically about what muscles are really being trained. Of course, those muscles are helping, right? Like we're training the hamstrings, we're training the glutes, we're training the spinal erectors, but I don't need to name those muscles in order to train that process. The effort there, the intent of me fighting off the floor with that slightly protracted position, a little bit rounding, helps way more than me saying like, okay, we're gonna work you in this, we're gonna try to emphasize the hamstrings just a little bit more. I don't care. I want people to be able to fight and be able to get as strong in that specific position as they can, and that will transfer a lot more. And then we can, choose different exercises for hypertrophy and worry in that direction a little bit more. So anyway, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it cleared up some of the different reasons why you would choose one over the other. If you do have questions, please leave me a comment and I'll get back to you on that. But if you like the video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.